We're going to get started. Thank you for being here. My name is Jason Stricker, and I'm the CEO of Insight Education Group. Insight is an organization that's been around for a couple of decades now. So we're almost 2 decades. This is our 19th year. We work in the States, but also in the Middle East. In the Middle East region, we have been working for about 4 years. Hi, welcome. And we have a partnership with QRTA, Queen Rania Teaching Academy, that focuses specifically on developing school leaders. So there's an advanced leadership program or advanced leadership academy. We have partnered with QRTA to develop the curriculum for that academy in conjunction with the University of Connecticut in the States. We come to Jordan to deliver that curriculum, to coach facilitators at QRTA and build their capacity to carry that further and to sustain the program. So I've been to Jordan. I think this is my 12th or 13th trip to Jordan. I've been to the Dead Sea 3 times. And each time I thoroughly enjoy my time here. I have to say that this time I am really enjoying the weather because when I left home in Connecticut, we had 6 inches of snow. And so coming to this weather at the Dead Sea has been a real treat. So in any case, I am hoping to get to know each of you a little bit better. I see many familiar faces in the room, so thank you for coming to the session. Looking forward to the dialogue. I think what will make this session really productive and valuable is your questions and your dialogue. And so please feel free to ask. Stop me at any time. My style is not the style where I just want to power through the presentation and make sure I get all the slides. So please feel free to stop and ask questions. I think it's through that dialogue and discourse that we learn. The session is on professional learning communities. So PLCs, professional learning communities, many of you engaging in PLCs in your own context, in your own schools, in your own organizations. A friend of mine here was sharing with me about some resources that they have had translated from Solution Tree into Arabic. So many resources I know that are available for you all on this topic. I'm going to share some of the learning that we have done at Insight with some of our partners in the States as we tried to implement professional learning communities. So much of what I talk about will be some of the challenges that we've encountered, how we've tried to overcome some of those challenges, but also just to be honest about what those challenges have been so that we can start to figure out how to solve those together and maybe, and hopefully, try to, you'll leave with some suggestions on how you can mitigate some of those same challenges that maybe you're experiencing or that you might experience in the future. If you want to continue the dialogue beyond the session, here's my information on Twitter and Instagram. So Insight Education Group, the broader organization, and then my handle for myself personally is strictly Jason. So feel free. I love seeing tweets and answering tweets and engaging in dialogue. So please feel free to do so. At Insight, I mentioned we've been around for 19 years, almost 2 decades. We do most of our work now with school leaders, with district leaders in the state, and with state-level leaders as well. We started as an organization working with teachers, and one of the things that holds true to our organization and our mission is the concept of alignment. When we started working with teachers, we were doing professional development on aligning standards, assessment, and instruction. We quickly learned that principals said to us, we want to continue this, but obviously you can't come into our school building every day, every week to the degree that's needed for the sustainability. So help us learn how to sustain this in our school. So we did, at that point, we began to work with school leaders and to really understand the unique context and perspective that school leaders bring to implementing any initiative, whether it be a PLC, a new curriculum, whatever it is. So we learned a lot through that. That's informed our work with the Advanced Leadership Training Program with QRTA, but also in PLCs. So we see leaders as a key to really successful implementation and sustainability. While I say that, I'm going to focus on how a leader can create the conditions for success but not lead a PLC today. And our work and my learning has been around how do we empower teachers to do this work, because if we don't do that, sustainability is really hard. And so we're going to talk a lot about that, and I just wanted to be transparent about that. It may be my bias, but it comes from my own experience. both as a teacher when I wasn't empowered to lead my own learning, to identify my own problems and find my own solutions, but also as we've done this work with school leaders, with states, and with now broader organizations, having teachers really drive the work because they're closest to the students. So drive the work of getting better in instruction is really critical. So I wanted to just put that out there, and that really shapes kind of a lot of what we do. While we work with leaders, we empower them to put conditions in place for teachers to really drive the work themselves. I'm going to just go over this quickly. Some of you have seen some of our other sessions. Michael Moody was here yesterday. He talked about the Best Foot Forward study. That's about video-based observation and coaching. Some of you may have seen Jason Culbertson. He talked a lot about these three levers: coaching, instructional leadership teams, and PLCs, which I'll be talking about today. But one thing that's important to us is to learn from others who are doing this work. And so some of these studies have been publications in which we've contributed to our lessons learned, or we have learned from ourselves. One of the seminal pieces of work that we learned a lot from around how to grow teachers was better feedback for better teaching. That started with an evaluation policy in the US that required every teacher to be evaluated 4 to 6 times every single year. And while there were good intentions behind that, it turned into a compliance exercise. So the intention was to give more feedback and better feedback to teachers, but what it quickly turned into was principals saying, I need to get into this classroom, but I don't have time because I have to do all these evaluations to give the type of feedback that I want to give to teachers. And so we saw a big disconnect, because anytime a principal's in a classroom, we feel like there should be good feedback and growth of a teacher, even if it's within an evaluation context. So what we learned from that is the importance of connecting those two, evaluation and feedback or growth, but also being really clear about this idea that it doesn't just have to be a leader who is the one giving feedback. There's so much value in a teacher self-reflecting, and there's so much value in teachers giving each other feedback, and that sits at the heart of this PLC model that I'm about to share with you, and so I wanted to be really transparent about that as well. And we learned some of those lessons through our writing in these works. These are the 3 levers that we work on a lot right now. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we do PLC work, we do instructional coaching, and we do instructional leadership team sort of training and support, but we don't do them in isolation. What's really important to us is that we connect the dots between those things. So for example, if we're going to engage in a PLC, this model that we're going to talk about, it can't be absent, in my mind and in my opinion, of the goals of the instructional leadership team and of the really important issues that that leadership team is saying we have to address at our school. But what also can't happen is the leadership team saying to the teachers, yes, we have a goal to improve literacy, so here's how you're going to study literacy. Teachers need the autonomy to study literacy in a way that makes sense to them, but it has to be aligned to the overall goal of the ILT. So we think about these 3 things as an ecosystem for overall school improvement. Instructional leadership teams, professional learning communities, and instructional coaching create an ecosystem for school improvement and ultimately for student learning. We are studying these 3 things in a large grant that the U.S. Department of Education has provided to us to do work across multiple states, and are now getting some good results from our external evaluation on the power of connecting these 3 things. Happy to share that more in-depth work with you offline outside of this presentation, but I also wanted to just be transparent with you about my own sort of theory of action around school improvement. It's really around these 3 things. We're going to dive into professional learning communities. So we're going to hone in on, put a magnifying glass on that one area of PLCs. And this is how we're going to do it, these 3 things today. We're going to look at some research, both within education and outside of education, that is the foundational research for this PLC model that we've developed with the Gates Foundation. We'll look at a framework that helps guide the work of PLC learning so that it can be efficient and effective. And then we'll think about next steps for collaboration within your own context in order to drive and improve student learning. So those 3 things are going to be the 3 things I hope we can accomplish in the next hour and a half. It's a tall order, is not a lot of time, but we'll try to move through it. Questions before we jump in? All right. So the first truth that we uncovered as we were studying about 10 years ago, how many of you have done PLCs or some sort of collaborative structure in your organization or building? Many of you, at least half in the room. When we started studying PLCs over 10 years ago, we saw that many schools and districts had a collaborative structure. Teachers were coming either during grade level or department meeting planning times or after school or before school. But what we found is that, yes, while teachers were trying to solve their own problem, this is a truth. Nobody knows teaching like teachers because they're closest to the work. They still weren't getting good results. What was not happening as an outcome of those PLCs was an improvement in student learning. And so because we didn't see that improvement in student learning, and the Gates Foundation was pouring a lot of money into PLCs because of this truth, they asked why. It was a simple question, but they said, why are we not seeing results in student learning? We have all the structures, we have the time, we have the money, the resources, and we have a theory of action that teachers need to solve their own problems. No one knows teaching like teachers, but for some reason we're not getting results. And so that is what we set out to study when we created this model of PLCs. The other thing that we learned is this idea of the plateau effect. And I would summarize this by saying experience is an unreliable guide to improvement. So in some PLCs that we walked into and studied, veteran teachers would say, I've been using this strategy for years. New teachers, I want you to learn how to use this strategy. That doesn't necessarily work. Because you're a teacher for a longer period of time, what we've learned through the study of these PLCs and the results that we were getting doesn't necessarily mean that you have the best strategies to contribute to the PLC. That may be a paradigm shift for you. In places where there's a clear hierarchy and time and tenure, this exists in the States. The longer you've been in a school, you get tenure. The more that you sort of have clout based on your experience. But what we learned is that's not always the case. And the plateau effect showed us this. Deborah Ball did this study. She said, after 4 years of teaching and math instruction, student learning plateaus in math. And you can see that even at some point, it starts to dip a little bit. So we asked ourselves, after 4 years of teaching, why are students not learning math? Why does their learning start to plateau and then decelerate? And what we discovered was it was because teachers were not learning at the rate that they needed to in order to continue that upward trajectory of student learning. So we set out to create a change. We wanted to change this trajectory so that teachers were learning really fast, not just after 4 years, but every single year. That required a paradigm shift for us because we were doing PLCs, we had collaboration time, and we still saw this plateau effect. So we had to figure out how to upend this a little bit, how to change it. So we said to ourselves, the way we want to change this is through this simple question. How do you know when a change is an improvement? Because the other thing that we saw was teachers meeting in collaboration time and PLCs. They would try a new strategy. So you're a teacher, you bring a strategy to me, I go try it in my class, and we don't talk about it anymore. We just try it because it worked for you. We assumed it should work for me. But what we didn't do was progress monitor or monitor the change that new strategy had in a different classroom or in a different grade level or in a different subject area. And so we had to put this question in front of ourselves and say, if you're bringing a new strategy to this collaboration group, how do you know that if I'm going to implement your new strategy, it will lead to an improvement? And it was that simple question that created a data through line of this PLC framework that I'm going to share with you that is central to the work. But sometimes we get really confused with data. There's so much data that we have in front of us. What we found is bringing this question back to teachers in every single collaboration session was really powerful. So if you're going to bring a strategy to the session, how do you know that a change is an improvement? Because what that guided was, a lot of studying, not just of student outputs, but our teaching practices. What practices created those outputs? And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. There's two pieces of research that serve as the foundation for STEP: positive deviance and improvement science. Anyone here familiar with positive deviance? A couple? Great. Improvement science? So both of these are now prevalent in education, but also come from other sectors. So we studied other sectors. We studied healthcare industry. We studied NGOs. We studied other nonprofits. We did study education. We studied the business community. And what we were studying was, where are organizations getting really good results, but that those results are driven by the people within the organization, not the leader. The workers in the organization, not the leader. And so I'm going to share just a couple of stories about these two pieces of research because they are the seminal foundational aspects of this PLC model. Positive deviance. The first story is about Vietnam. There are high incidences or high degrees of malnutrition in Vietnam. Multiple villages in Vietnam, lots of children malnutrition. Vietnam had lots of technical expertise that was coming into the country to try and solve this problem for them. So they had many people from the outside saying, we think we can solve this for you. The World Health Organization, many other organizations saying, we're going to give you money, we're going to give you resources, we're going to give you strategies to solve malnutrition. None of them worked. All outside expertise that were good, but the implementation of them or whatever it was just did not work. With all of those outside experts coming in, there was still over 85% malnutrition or persistence of malnutrition. So Vietnam said, we have to figure out a way to tackle this problem differently. There was a group of people that were headed by these man and a woman, man and wife, and they were called the Sternans. And the Sternans said, we are not going to bring our technical expertise to you, but what we are going to bring are really good questions and outside observation and objective observation. And we want 6 months. We want 6 months to study malnutrition in Vietnam, and at the end of those 6 months, we think we can get some traction on this problem. So the country of Vietnam said, okay, let's try it, but we'll only try it if there's limited resources that we have to put into it because we've expanded kind of as much as we can on the resources. So it was very low lift, very little money that had to be spent. All they did was go into villages and watched how they were feeding children. That's all they did. They wrote down every strategy, every action that the adults took. And what they found was there were very similar constraints, very similar resources. So across the country, they had the same levels of the type of food, the same way they prepared the food, same access to that food. But what they found is that in some villages, there were very low degrees of malnutrition. And so they tried to figure out, what are they doing? What are they doing differently? And it was a very, very simple fix. Every village wanted to serve children first. So they would create a bunch of soup. This is the primary way to feed children, the primary form of nutrition, soup. They would make the soup. They would ladle the soup to children first, and the children would all eat first. In those villages that had lower degrees of malnutrition, they found that the ladles were coming from the very bottom of the soup. So they were reaching all the way to the bottom, getting the nutrients, the shrimp, the vegetables, etc., that had settled to the bottom. They were getting those good nutrients into the bowls of their children who they were serving first. In other villages, they were serving from the top. They weren't thinking about getting those nutrients because it was all good intent, right? We all have good intent when we try new strategies in our classrooms too. They all had good intent. Very simple fix. So they went to the other villages and said, here's what we found. Would you be willing to try this? Of course. It's a no-brainer, as we say, right? So all other villages tried this. Within 6 months, the degrees of malnutrition went from 85% to 15%. Now they're almost eradicated. Simple fix. No additional expertise other than an objective eye watching, studying, trying that. They tried that solution in other villages. It was very easy for them to do. And they confirmed that it worked in other villages, and so they scaled that throughout the entire country. That's positive deviance. So what positive deviance says is, given the same constraints, the same resources, there are assets and bright spots within our own community. We just have to look and find them. So we wanted to apply that to education. There are assets and bright spots in every single one of your schools, in every single one of your organizations. We simply have to look and find them. And we have to study what those positive deviants, the ones that are getting uncommonly good results, what they're doing differently and how they're doing that. That's what STEP, this PLC model, is really based on, this concept of positive deviance. The other concept it's based on is improvement science. I want you to just to yourself read these 6 aspects or core principles of improvement science. And the question I want you to ask yourself is, which of these 6, if you made it more explicit or present in your work, would help you get better results? Which of these 6? This is my way for you to sort of process these 6 principles. Yes, please. I will keep these up as we talk, so if you want to take these down. I'll also share the presentation, by the way, so it'll be available. The question in front of you, pick one. It's a forced choice. If you had to pick one of these, which one of the, and make it more explicit in your work, as you're collaborating and working with other teachers or leaders, which of these 6 would help improve your work? Anyone? Yes?
I think the first one would, because you're thinking about who's actually using the system, it's user-centered.
Yeah.
And so that would be a lot more effective.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this gets to the sort of one of the keys of the PLC model that we created, that it has to be user-centered. In other words, it has to be authentic and relevant for the person that we're trying to solve a problem for. And I can't identify your problem. You have to identify your own problem. And then you have to find your own solution. So in that way, you also have to do that, though, with your colleagues if we want to scale this, right? It's a slightly different paradigm than the leader saying, I've looked at our data, now we're in a data protocol meeting, and let's analyze the data, but that the leader is kind of pushing and facilitating the group to say, we need a new literacy intervention program, for example. This principle doesn't do that. This principle gets teachers together, all literacy teachers, and asks them, what is your problem? Let's look at the data. You look at the data. You tell me as the leader what you think the problem is. I'll create some conditions for you in which you can study that problem and find a good solution. So it's a code development issue where multiple teachers are making the work specific and user-centered. That's the other caveat I want to put on this. It's not just one teacher. It's a code development issue with multiple teachers coming together, the best brains collectively trying to solve their problem. Yes?
Talking about the success of the work in a class, I think all of them should be done.
Yeah, of course, all of these should be done.
So
this is just...
I couldn't say that one of them is more important than the other.
Fair, right? One may not be more important than the other. My way for you to process it was to make you make a forced choice, that's all. Yeah, but agreed. These are all incredibly important. Is there one that you think in your own work stands out that you'd want to start to address? Anyone else? Yes, in the back?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I thought you had a hand up, but if
No,
not.
I'm disagreeing. I think that the number one is really getting teachers to own problems as a teacher might, you know,
Yep.
and really having the chance to input and give ideas and strategies for how we can rectify it, and really having that input I think is so valuable.
Yeah, so one of the themes, and this is again my own transparency and my bias, is that we have to empower teachers to do this work. If we don't, we will never be sustainable at scale. Absolutely, yes?
I do agree with my colleague when he said that the 6 points are important. However, I will go with point number 4. We cannot improve at scale what we cannot measure.
Absolutely.
And I already also attended the session yesterday about video coaching. The thing is, like when you need to collaborate with your colleague, someone, to think about pedagogy, you need to apply it inside the class.
Yes.
You need to focus in a common measurable variables or tangible or smart variables that you can check the improvement, for example, or the progress for the students themselves.
Yes.
Or you can ask a measurable question: to what extent this class was engaging? How could I improve it? So it's not easy to put measurable variables to see the progress of the students or even by yourself.
Yes. When we started to implement this model, one of the lessons that we learned was we said, data has to sit at the center of every decision you make. The way teachers interpreted that when we first started this work is they were only looking at outcome data, student achievement data. So what results are we getting? What this principle says is it's not just output data, that is important, student achievement data, but we also have to study and monitor the inputs. And we have to monitor the progress of those inputs. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. That's also at the heart of our step work, this PLC model. If we only study the outputs, what we lose is the opportunity to make a fine-grained tweak or small change in the way that we delivered instruction that may get a really good output, may get good student achievement data. If we don't actually codify or take a video of how we're introducing a lesson or how we're delivering it to students, and all we do are look at the outputs, we lose the opportunity to gain a valuable strategy because we write it off. We say it's not going to work because I don't have the same results that you do. So we fight against that temptation by saying let's measure the inputs and codify them, but let's also measure the outputs. Yes?
Like we're all teachers, isn't it, fundamentally? So in a classroom, we would never ask a child to write an end product.
Absolutely.
Like in day-to-day life in a classroom, we would never ask a child to do the end product without supporting them or monitoring them along the way.
Yes.
And then picking up new things, because we might stand there and think our lesson's perfect.
Yes.
But they will come back and say, well, actually, we pick up a new thing.
Yes.
So if we don't do that day to day in the classroom, why would we do it leading?
Absolutely. Yes. No, it's a great point. I want to actually highlight number 2 as a result of your comment. Number 2 says variation in performance is the core problem to address. So this is, can we get results for everyone, right? So imagine you're a parent now. In the States, and I'm a parent, I have 6 kids, by the way. Yep, my oldest is 15, my youngest is 3. Yes. 4 girls, 2 boys, so very blessed. But what I often find myself doing as a parent is fighting for the best teacher, the best first grade teacher, the best second grade teacher. We know who those teachers are. Parents talk to each other, right? All the time. I'm sure if you're a school leader, when I was a school leader, I experienced this from the other side of the coin. And my message to parents was, they're all great. Don't worry about it. They weren't all equally great, unfortunately. I wish they were. What this gets at is every teacher needs to be equally great in order to create equity in your school or across a system. Now, that's really hard to achieve. So when we break that down, that's one aspect of this. In order to achieve that, what this principle says is we need to study not only what works, does the way in which you teach the quadratic equation, because it works for you and you're getting good results, not just what works, but why does it work? Why does it work for you? And under what conditions? When did you teach that class? What time of the day? How many students did you have? What type of interaction and questions did you ask those students? And for whom? So it's not just did it work or what works, it's under what conditions, for whom, and how. It's all those things. So variation in performance is based on those 4 questions. What works, for whom, how, and why. Yes?
So now you're saying something that is not really very clear in these 6 points, but it's there and it's very important.
Yes, please.
It's the kind of questions we ask to get to the core problem.
Absolutely.
Because the questions we ask get us the answers. So we need to be smart enough to ask the smart questions.
Yes.
Like, for example, I've never thought about what time of the day I taught that lesson, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So to make all of this work, we have to have the skill to manipulate the questions and play around them.
Yes, yes. Great point. And that's what STEP, this PLC model, is all about. It's giving you enough autonomy that you feel like you're solving the problem, number one. The work is user-centered. It's your issue. It's your solution. But it's putting enough structure around how you solve that problem that you can, in fact, ask those questions really well, that you can use data really well, that you have some confidence and reliability in the strategies you choose, that they're going to get good results. That's what STEP is all about. I want to keep moving, and we'll keep with the questions in just a moment. So there's some shared characteristics. I talked about positive deviance, and I talked about improvement science. These are the two foundational principles or pieces of research that sit at the center of STEP. They both share these characteristics, though. They're problem of practice focused. It's user-centered. So you're bringing, as teachers, problems to the table. As coaches, you might bring your own problems as a coaching team to the table. There's a measurement focus. We can only improve what we can measure. So there's data that's throughout this entire framework that I'm going to share with you. Experimentation. In order for us to get better, to innovate, which is that last one, teachers and innovators, we have to be willing to fail. That word is not written up here, but the term experimentation means that we have to be okay with some level of failure. As long as we fail fast and we learn from that failure and we make other decisions as a result of that. But that's what's at the heart of this model, that it's okay to fail. What that means is if you're my STEP team now, we're all a PLC, and I'm facilitating, we have to have a lot of trust with each other. And transparency. And that's not easy. It's really easy to say. It's not easy to do. So in the STEP framework that I'm going to share with you and the playbook, which is a bunch of resources that hopefully will be helpful in your work, there are a lot of facilitation strategies that help you build that trust. We spend a lot of time when we first interact, when we launch STEP meetings in schools, just building trust with teachers because of that experimentation issue. All right, so that led us to STEP. All those things that I just talked about, we studied with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, we want to fund some of this work. So they funded Insight to develop this STEP model. Supporting Teacher Effectiveness Project is what it stands for. And we spent about 3 years developing the model, testing it, putting our sort of own, using these practices that I just talked about in our own development of the model. So experimenting, failing. Oh, I don't know why it's doing this. I'm sorry. Let me just relaunch this, so hopefully we can avoid that. Okay. So what is STEP? I've talked a little bit about some of these issues already, but it's in every school community, there are these uncommonly good results that are happening, good strategies that are getting to better solutions, but it's not because a school has more resources, they have a different curriculum, they have the same constraints, but they're getting better results. Why is that the case? So STEP is definitely teacher-friendly, and it looks for those bright spots in every community. What are the bright spots? What are the positive deviants that we're finding? It definitely relies on teachers as creative problem solvers. We've talked a lot about that already. You have to be willing to fail, to be creative, to experiment, and to innovate. It builds on the skills that will help teachers and administrators improve over time. So this is not about, hey, I need a quick fix strategy that I can implement right away in my classroom and then, forget about that and move it on to the next strategy. You're in an ongoing way thinking about the results those strategies are getting. This is what the framework looks like. So I said earlier that we experimented ourselves. And PLCs are not new. So the work of Dufour, the work of many others that have come before us, this work stands on the good work of those people. It stands on the shoulders of those folks. What we, though, realized is that we were starting to plateau as a field in our ability to get better through PLCs. And what teachers were telling us was it's because we like the autonomy that we're having in our PLC meeting, but we don't feel like we have just the right amount of structure in order to know what to do at the end of a meeting. So teachers were leaving PLC meetings saying, we had good discussions, but I'm not sure what my next step is. I'm not sure how to implement this strategy that you brought. I'm not sure what to do with the data that we just analyzed. And so they were leaving with the feeling that the discussion was fine, but there's nothing in it for me. So what happened is teachers started to stop going to PLCs. In Long Beach, we studied this phenomenon, in Boston, and in the middle of the country in the States, with many districts across about 3 or 4 states in the middle of the country. Across the board, every single one of these districts, the same phenomenon. They had PLCs in place for a long time. They had great attendance at those PLCs, but then their attendance plateaued and started to go down. So in Long Beach, for example, when they started PLCs 15 years ago, they had over 90% attendance. When we started to work with them about 5 or 6 years after they had PLCs in place, they had less than 20% attendance because teachers were not getting something out of it. It was very simple for us. We had to make this more valuable time for teachers. And what we learned was that teachers said we need a little more structure and better facilitation. And so, but we want to keep our autonomy. There's always a but in those conversations, right? But we want to keep our autonomy. And so we created this framework that does hopefully both of those things. It gives enough structure to guide the process, but inherent in that structure is autonomous decision making that teachers have. So here's the 4 steps. Seek a common problem of practice. We are all a PLC group now. We are looking at our data. We're finding and deciding as a group what the common problem is that we want to address. Once we've identified that common problem, we go into our school community and we find who's getting good results in relation to that problem. I used the quadratic equation example earlier. I'll stay with that example. If our common problem of practice is that only 10% of our students are mastering or demonstrating proficiency in Math 1, and we drilled down into the data and we saw that the logic that students have to apply to solve the quadratic equation is not there. It's not strong enough. And so that's our common problem of practice. Now, who's doing that really well? For us. We see for us as data, and it shows us that he's getting great results on introducing and teaching to mastery the quadratic equation. So now let's all go study for us. He's our positive deviant in the discover phase. We're discovering a promising practice. We go watch him, but we don't just look at the results he's getting. We codify what he does, how he does it, all those things I talked about before in terms of variation. Why does it work? How does it work? For whom? We list who the teachers are in his classroom. We may even videotape his classroom because we want to be able to objectively see when we come back to our PLC meeting what he did. Then we say to ourselves, I like the way Faraz is doing things. I feel like I can do it, and I feel like I can get those results. Let's all, as math teachers now, go try that. That's the confirm stage. We go try the strategy Faraz is using to teach the quadratic equation. There's a try, do, study, do, act kind of cycle in here. The try, measure, decide. We don't just implement that strategy and hope for good results. We implement it. We study and codify what we did. So I'm going to videotape the way I teach. We're going to compare that to the way Faraz taught. And now we're going to look at the data. So now we have many pieces of evidence. We have the output data. I'm getting these kinds of results. They're not quite as good as Faraz. Faraz is getting certain results. Here's how I taught. Here's how he taught. Where's the gap? Where's the mismatch? That all happens in the confirm stage. Before we scale this strategy across our entire school, and this is I think, really critical because it happens all the time in my experience. I see Faraz uses a good strategy, he gets good results, and the school leader says, everyone will teach the quadratic equation the way Faraz did. Doesn't take into account variation, it doesn't take into account context, it doesn't take into account any of those things. It doesn't even take into account my own knowledge. of the quadratic equation. That might be the issue. So in the confirm stage, all those things are revealed because we're studying what I say in the classroom compared to what Faraz says. We're studying how I interact with the students compared to how Faraz interacts with the students. And once we feel like we can all get the same results, only then do we share this strategy and say, we're going to scale this school-wide, organization-wide. In that confirm stage, what happens more often than not is we reveal a small change, as I mentioned earlier, that I could make in how I introduce the quadratic equation. I may just need to define it 3 different ways. I may need to make it more relevant because Faraz says, here's how you use the quadratic equation every day in life. I never did that in my own teaching, but I didn't know that until I studied both of us. That's a small change. If I make that change in my class, then I can get better results. So I go back, I make that change, I study again, did I get good results? And if I did get good results, now I have some reliability that 2 of us teaching the same content but in different contexts with different students, different time of day, we can get the same results. It's only then do I scale the strategy and share it with others. One of the problems that we experience in education is strategy and initiative fatigue. And it's because we don't do this sort of due diligence about how does the strategy work. We only say it works for someone, so it must work for me. This mitigates that issue. So if a strategy doesn't work, I would go back, maybe make a small tweak. I might have to eventually look for a new strategy, quite frankly, because for us, the way he does something is so unique it can't be scaled. So then I go look for another positive deviant. That's what the arrow back, this arrow is, from confirm back to discover.
As if you're testing a hypothesis.
Scientific method, as if you're testing the hypothesis.
Yes.
Absolutely. So you can see that there's some logic to this, right? A linear progression, seek, discover, confirm, but I don't go right from confirm to share. I may have to go back to discover. Once I confirm it works, through that example that I just spelled out for you, then I share. That step. Here's what it looks, before I go on, I'm going to start to get into the logistics now. How many teachers meet? When do they meet? What are they saying about it? I'm going to show you a video of teachers responding to this. But before I move on, are there any questions about the framework itself?
No, I would like to go back a little bit for the 6 core. I would like to ask one question about the 6 core.
Great. One question on the 6 core principles, and then we'll move on.
I'd like to ask, these 6 cores, before 40 years were not applied, right? Can we assume that the education at that time was not successful? This is the point, because network,
Yeah.
media, and measurable outcomes. I don't think that these strategies were known before 40 or 50 years. Can we assume that education at that time was not successful?
Maybe. I don't know. I think that education at that time was successful based on what we knew at the time.
Okay.
Right? I think if we are good learners, I asked this question, I did a pre-institute earlier on, was it Thursday or Friday? Friday. Yeah, Friday. I asked the question, there were 40 or so people in the room. I said, how many of you are learners? 90% of the room raised their hand, but 10% didn't. And I said, you need to raise your hand. Because you're all learners. The point I'm trying to make here is that we probably were doing the best with what we knew at the time. And so now we've learned a lot. And we've learned about these principles, which is why I'm putting them in front of you. And we're continuing to learn. One of the new learnings is about networked improvement communities. Our grant in the U.S., the Department of Education, was all about the power of leveraging one district's learning for another. And how do we connect across multiple states where it's a 5-hour plane ride? How do we connect the learning from one to the next in this networked improvement community?
Yes.
That's a new phenomenon.
Maybe they were applied, but at a very small scale according to the constraints.
Great. Yes. Yeah, there are different constraints at the time.
At that
Technology
constraints.
is a big accelerator for us now.
Yes.
If you were in the session with Michael on, my colleague Michael Moody on video, that's a huge accelerator.
Yes.
Yes,
And
great,
it's very
great
important.
point.
Last point, that I cannot apply these six core principles at timing is very important. Me as a chemistry teacher, I cannot apply these the last session of chemistry for example, for grade 11 students. It's completely different when I give the lesson the first session or the second session.
Sure.
So you might exclude some of these points depending on timing.
Yeah. So my intent in sharing these with you is that these are a way to create improvement over time, not just in one particular discrete lesson. Yes, so it's a very good point. Okay, I want to share with you a couple of other things about the actual framework and some of the logistics, and then I want you to hear from some teachers who have used STEP. So STEP teams, there's a big caveat to this. They're typically self-selected groups of about 12 to 16 teachers. If you have a much bigger organization, you can get a little bigger than that. So you could have 20 people meeting in a PLC. As you start to get above 25 or 30, the amount of facilitation that has to happen is really hard with that many people to reach consensus on the problem, the positive deviant solution you're looking for, etc. So size is important. But this is not a prescription. So there are some constraints here, right? Like 12 to 16 teachers is about the sweet spot. Weekly meetings, 1 hour weekly meetings is what we would encourage and what we've done in our implementation of STEP to get some of the results. I'll share results with you in just a little bit. So weekly meetings, 1 hour each week. Typically our schools have an hour before or after school or during a grade level or department meeting. Monthly coach meetings. So in addition to teachers meeting in their PLC, there's a coach who's facilitating that meeting, and the coaches meet once a month. And the coaches do their own sort of STEP process where they're looking at the seek phase, which just came before us. What went well? What could we change and get better for the next time we implement? What's coming up in the discover phase? How can we sort of predict some challenges and talk together as a group about how to address those challenges? Because if you have multiple coaches implementing STEP in one building or across multiple buildings, it's important that we have some calibration across these facilitators, and the monthly coach meetings do that for us. Support's provided. So in our experience in implementing STEP, there's a summer boot camp. It's a 2 to 3 day boot camp, typically facilitated by Insight, and we also facilitate those monthly coach meetings for 6 to 12 months, depending on how long it takes the school. Sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's 1 month. It's different for each engagement, but we facilitate those. But there's also a playbook. We've codified a lot of our lessons learned into a thick playbook that's organized by step phase. The 4 phases of the playbook have facilitation strategies for each phase. They have protocols for each phase. They have how to look at data, because data is a big through line. So all of that is in this playbook that I will share as a resource with you later. I want to share with you now what teachers and leaders are saying about STEP from their experience, and then ask you a couple of questions.
One of the biggest challenges that I see that teachers are experiencing is the fact that they are in isolation. They teach in a classroom, they stay in a classroom, and there's not a lot of collaboration that's built in.
The greatest challenges our teachers face, as well as our administrators, is all the multiple demands that are placed on them from federal, state government, local government, and just the needs of our students.
Obviously, you want to reach every student every day, and you want to provide the best education possible for them, which means being prepared yourself. And a lot of times that requires that we step outside of our classroom and collaborate with our peers.
The way we've been looking at our challenges in the last 2 decades, to be very honest with you, is that professional development. STEP comes into the play where you can differentiate.
STEP itself is supporting teacher effectiveness project and really supporting teachers to do their magic in the classroom.
It's based on a process called positive deviance. You start off with the observation that there are individuals within a particular community who have maybe uncommon approaches to different things, but somehow they're getting successful results. Yet they have the same resources, same constraints, same expectations as everyone else.
STEP emphasizes the fact that the answers to the questions are right here. We don't have to look to the outside, but everything we need to bring about solutions are right here among us.
So it's teachers collaborating with teachers, teachers coming up with solutions to issues that are in the classroom every day.
Being on a STEP team is a completely voluntary process. And it's when you step up to STEP, you're saying, I trust my colleagues, I may be a little nervous, but I'm really interested in this reflective learning process.
With STEP, the teachers are working together as a group, and they are deciding where they need help and what's relevant to their needs and to their students. We have schools that are focused on collaborative discussions, academic vocabulary, mathematics, you name it. So it starts there where the teachers are making that decision about what it is they're going to focus in on. Then they're able to go to their colleagues and try to find out by observation, interviewing teachers, interviewing students, and figuring out who's already figured this out, who's doing well. We have teachers already making changes in their classroom. STEP is important to help teachers try to connect that with the data as to are these practices really effective? And they come together and they start to analyze that data and analyze their observation data, and they determine that, teacher A is having great success. Let's go learn from teacher A. Let's all try it in our classrooms. And then if it really works, if it's effective, if it's something that we all can do, then let's share it with our entire school site. So that students are hearing one message, and then of course, because there's such an impact throughout their day, they're going through 6 teachers and hearing the same message, they just academically, they start to improve. And so that's what's so powerful about this project.
Good morning, third period.
Good morning,
I see a bigger change in teachers' enthusiasm for working together, for collaborating. Things are more positive. There was more of an approach of, I'm gonna try something new. I'm gonna give it a shot. And I see a more positive push to innovate.
STEP has changed my way of thinking and approaching problems in the classroom, just in that I feel empowered to solve those problems myself. I don't look towards administration to tell me and wait for administration to guide me. If there's a problem, I bring it to the table and then we work from there. So STEP has provided me that opportunity.
It's really coming from that collective voice, which is really, really important. And the superintendent doesn't have to say, you have to do X, Y, and Z. My job then becomes, how do I support X, Y, and Z if it's getting a good byproduct?
We all want to be our best, and to be working at that together with your colleagues is just going to be a real accelerator.
It is exactly what education has needed for a very, very long time.
So what questions did this raise for you after watching the video? What questions came up? I want to spend a few minutes on some questions before I share some of the results that STEP has gotten. So we've talked about the framework, we've talked about the logistics, you've heard from teachers and leaders who are implementing STEPs. What questions came up for you as a result of watching this video? And if you do have a question, yes, I'll ask that you please use the mic.
I have a couple of questions. The first question is, suppose that you make uncommon approach or pedagogy inside your classroom.
Yep.
And it was agreed it was effective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it risky, like when someone trying to copy you exactly?
Yeah.
Or to imitate you? This is the first question.
Yeah.
And
I'm
the second,
going to stop on that one real quick and answer it. The change in the variation that's important to take into account, that second principle of improvement science addresses that question. It's not you imitating me exactly. It's you using the fundamental philosophy, approach, instructional strategy that will work for your own context. You've made it your own, and you've studied that you can make it your own and make it work through the confirm phase of STEP. So in that way, you know that it's going to be sustainable in your class. You're not just imitating Jason or Faraz or Kamal or any of those other folks. You're making it your own. However, there are some fundamental things that will work in every single classroom. I will spend the first 3 minutes introducing and engaging students in the objectives of the quadratic equation. And within those 3 minutes, I will give a real-life example of how the quadratic equation is used in the world. You choose your own example. You don't use Faraz's example. You don't use my example. You choose your own. But you introduce it to students, and in the first 3 minutes, you give a real-life example. That's how we can create some sustainability and replication across classrooms and across schools, but still give you autonomy to infuse your own style, your own examples. Those examples are also going to come from students, right? Because Faraz may have a very different group of students, and the example he gives, your students aren't going to care about maybe. So those are the ways, I think, to address your question, hopefully.
Second question, like on the one hand, I know that all of that is on behalf or towards the students, I mean, performance.
Yeah. Yes.
On the other hand, like suppose that I made unfamiliar approach or pedagogy.
Yes.
Like I like to have the attention, or I like to have the credit for myself because
Yes.
I did start it. Was that wrong?
This is a good point. When I say teachers need to be vulnerable to share some of their failures, what I've also experienced is vulnerability is about sharing a success as well. Because sometimes when we get together as a group of teachers, I don't want to show that I have a good answer in front of my colleagues because they'll think I'm bragging, they'll think that I'm a know-it-all, whatever you want to say, right? And that turns people off sometimes. They don't like that. They don't want to collaborate with you. We have to break those barriers down. We have to break those walls down. It's okay to share a success. What we say in STEP is how you share that success is really important. So here's a good example. I wouldn't come to you all and say, I'm the best teacher in the world. I know how to teach the quadratic equation. Khalil, right? Yes. Khalil, you should do it my way. Good luck. Right? That's horrible. Like you will not want to work with me, but I would say, hey, I have an idea. Would you like to come, can we work together? It's a way of communication, and communication is a really key aspect in STEP. When I talk about facilitation and facilitation strategies, it is very much about how we communicate with one another. Yes?
Excuse me.
One question in the back, then I'll come back up. Yeah?
Oh, I just had a question about, sorry, I'm loud, the sweet spot for numbers.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like, let's say you have a staff of 20.
Yep.
Of primary teachers, for example.
Yep.
With 12 to 16 teachers,
Yep.
I mean, in terms of the ratio of teachers who are not initially participating, and how, like, do we use positive kind of peer pressure to get them involved?
Yes.
Or if there's only a few teachers who are not involved, what is that dynamic like?
Great point. Staff of 20, I would say 3 to 5. Okay. 3 to 5 teachers, to be like really direct in an answer. Yeah. Because less than 3, in our experience, you don't have enough like dialogue, you don't have enough positive deviance amongst the 3 to kind of, or enough reliability when you test a positively deviant strategy. So minimum of 3. Around 5 is even better. With 5, you're going to get more momentum faster in your staff of 20. If 3 of us have tested a strategy, we then start to share it with others. And so it takes a little longer to share from 3 to 20 than it does 5 to 20, right? But the other thing is that in Long Beach, we started with, I think it was 5 schools in year 1. So a little bit different scale, but instead of teachers, we're talking schools now. 5 schools. Word quickly spread that I'm now getting something out of this session. I want to go to these PLC meetings because I feel like it's worth my time. The investment is worth it. We went from 5 schools to 15 schools in year 2 to 25 schools in year 3 to the entire district in year 4, over 100 schools. It just spreads like that fast because of the confidence teachers have in the process, and it's because principals aren't saying, also like we went and introduced this to the, so when you introduce this to your staff, we say to principals, you're not leading this. We're going to meet with you as principals first so that you know if this is the right context and the right initiative for you right now. Then principal, you're going to introduce this to your staff and you're going to ask for volunteers. The volunteer part that you saw in the video was really critical because volunteers then they are more likely to say, hey, this is working for me. I want to share this with my colleagues, rather than the school leader saying, you have to go to that PLC session. So 3 to 5, short answer.
I think, can I do it without the mic?
Please, yeah. Or no. Oh, it's because of the camera we have to do the mic, sorry.
I think you've answered the question before, but I'm wondering, like, we're humans, right? And everyone's volunteered to join this group.
Yes.
And everyone has trust, and everyone has focus.
Yes.
But in a day-to-day life, like, we have something that might trigger something in our minds that day. So maybe, like, in a meeting, like, we get sidetracked by something.
Yep.
So what evidence is shown how you get them back on the track? So say, like, Joe Blogg says, really hasn't got it. I've tried everything you've told me, and like today my head's not in this frame of mind. How do we get everyone back on track?
Yeah, great.
Because we still have to develop, we're humans, so we need to have the feeling of empathy and trust in that meeting, but you also need the end product.
Yeah.
So how have we dealt with that?
I wish you were in one of our other sessions on the instructional leadership team meeting, this 5-star meeting protocol. In 60 minutes, in a 60-minute meeting, the very first thing we do is a personal and professional check-in.
I was in that meeting, so now I know.
So connect it to that. Yeah, so one thing that does is it clears some of those issues that you're dealing with, right? You may be from home. It may be a student that you had a particularly challenging time with that day. It may be a parent call that you had just made or that you have to make. You're thinking about all these things, and you're right, we're humans. We do a personal and professional best. Sometimes what happens during that time is people say, I don't have a best today. I had a pretty hard day. So, and here's why it was hard. And we spend 10 minutes in the meeting just saying, how can we support you? Now let's move on. So that's one way. The second way is that we have a very clear expectation of what to achieve at the outcome of that meeting. So we're super clear that this meeting is about the following 3 things. We have to set an observation protocol, for example, for going into Firas's class. If we do not get that observation protocol done by the end of the day, we have to wait another week to do that. So let's work really hard to get that observation protocol done so that we can go. Because between the meetings, what has to happen is we all have to go and observe Firas. So if we don't get the observation protocol done, then it's going to delay us another week, and we can't afford for our students to waste another week of instruction. It's those kinds of conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Here's some results. Here are the type of results that we got. Here's what STEP teachers said. 92% were communicating more with fellow teachers about very specific teaching practices as a result of STEP. So this is about communication. The next one is participation. 100% participation in the STEP team. And that's provided opportunities to learn from other team members. 100% said this. 92% increased collaboration with other teachers as a result of participating in STEP. What's not showing in this data is really important. In Long Beach, one of their problems of practice was academic vocabulary. They wanted their students to be better consumers and users of academic vocabulary. The English teachers got together and said, this is our problem. The STEP coach said, this might not just be your problem. Let's see if that exists in other places, like in science, in math, but let's expand and think out of the box, and let's go to the performing arts. Does this exist in art, in band, in music? And it did. The band director in that particular band teacher in that school said, I also have a problem with academic vocabulary. I'm trying to get my students to use very technical terms when I'm teaching them about music. And so I don't know quite what strategies to use. So the language arts teacher, the band teacher, math teacher, and science teacher all got together in an interdisciplinary STEP meeting, team cohort, and they solved that problem of practice. So increased collaboration with other teachers doesn't have to just be with the same content area or the same grade level.
Did you study the efficacy state students learning or achieving?
Yeah, let me show you that. I think that's the 3rd slide. 87% of STEP teachers are more likely to use data. 80% made changes to their practice. These are still teachers. 100% strengthened their instructional practice. 60% of the schools transitioned to full teacher leadership structures, meaning it wasn't just a coach that was facilitating these. Now there was a position called STEP coach that may be different than like content coach that a teacher could step into. And so it created this level of responsibility for a teacher to stay in the classroom, but also to assume new responsibilities, so they were growing their own professional practice and staying at that school longer. To your point on student data, these were 3 different problems of practice that were studied. Students justifying their word choice in a class or group of discussion, the percent of those. At the baseline, it was 15. After STEP, after the confirmed phase, 37% were justifying their word choice in a class or group discussion. So we saw a 22% change in that. The percent of teachers reporting that more than 75% of their students can orally explain their reasoning using mathematical language. I know many of you have taught math sessions here, and many of those math sessions are about not just getting the right answer, but getting into a kid's head and having them explain that reasoning. That's what this problem was all about. 18% of students were explaining their reasoning before STEP. 56% were explaining their reasoning after STEP. 38% change. The last one, percent of teachers reporting the most students participate in class. Engagement is really important in class. Purposeful engagement. 46% before STEP, 70% afterwards, 24% change. So those are just some examples. And the reason I use these is because we could very directly correlate what was happening in the STEP meetings to these results. Yes, aggregate student achievement was changing, but there are so many variables. And as you all know, it's really hard to say that one thing was the change that made an impact on student achievement. So we tried to create a more direct line in our reporting of these numbers, which is why I'm sharing these numbers with you. So here are some things to consider when implementing STEP. Lots of benefits, obviously. You're going to reduce variability, which we talked about. You're going to test instructional solutions from within, no outside expert saying do this. And you're going to build your capacity to continue finding great practice one year after the next, one STEP team after the next. Some key considerations before you launch STEP. Do you have the right data systems? Do you have the right data protocols? Does your staff, do your STEP team members know how to look at data? Are they data literate and assessment literate? Those are really critical questions to having a successful STEP team. Competing initiatives. Do you have another PLC logic model that you're using? Now you're layering this one on top of it and teachers are confused. Don't do that. Pick one or the other. I don't care if you pick STEP, but don't create competing initiatives. Willingness to test curriculum and instruction. If you have a curriculum in place and you're not willing to test it to say, even if it's really good, in STEP, you're going to put that curriculum to the test. You're going to say there might be pieces of that curriculum that we need to modify. There might be changes to the way we introduce the curriculum. If you're not willing to test that, STEP is going to be kind of hard for you to implement. You have to be willing to test your curriculum and instruction. This is an example of the playbook. This is what the cover looks like. This is a sample chapter, and I share it with you for 2 reasons. All of the chapters are organized the same way. There's an overview, there are key activities, there's STEP in practice, which shows you examples of protocols filled out, video examples, a chapter summary, and then tools, the kind of blackline masters that you can use. This is something that I didn't talk about. This phase is the launch phase. So remember in STEP, there's seek, discover, confirm, and share are the 4 phases. Before we do that, there's a launch phase where we have to ask ourselves, are we ready for STEP? And that's what this chapter in the playbook asks. How do you onboard STEP coaches? How do you bring them on successfully? How do you train them? What are the criteria for selecting who's going to actually participate in STEP? Creating and distributing the program overview and welcome materials. So some of this is very tactical and logistical. But if you're about to undertake this, what was important to us is that we produce a product that would help you get there faster. So that's why it's organized in the way that it is. These essential elements I didn't talk a lot about, but they're really critical to the success of STEP. There are 4 essential elements. Data and measurement, excellent facilitation. I've talked about both of those throughout. Content and context knowledge. So we do have to have, this is about testing content-specific strategies and testing them within different contexts. That's what that's about. Leadership and culture is that we're creating bottom-up change. Teachers are creating this, but also top-down. Leaders are putting in the conditions for success.
Actually, can I ask a question? Can we download this book? Or?
Yes, and so to get more information about this book, which is the last thing I'm going to share with you, it's okay, I got you. All right, so there's our website. There's my email. You can find the playbook there on the website. You can, and of course the social media stuff. I would say that certainly please take advantage of the playbook. There are also structures that I think are important to consider. Virtual trainings on STEP, webinars on STEP in order to really launch this successfully. It just comes from my personal experience when we've launched in Long Beach, in Boston, in the 4 districts in the middle of the states. In other Middle Eastern countries that we are working, we've launched STEP and done a boot camp. The boot camp is really important to set a solid foundation, as is sort of the initial webinars to help you through the launch phase, the site selection, some of the questions that we started to talk about here, but we didn't have a chance to really fully engage in. So if you're interested in that, please email me here, and I'm happy to engage in some of those questions with you. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the general session that's coming up at 1 o'clock.